night 26 centuries ago, a city on a wide, dark river. You come to it the way everyone came to it, from a long way off, across flat and empty land, and you see the walls first. They rise out of the plain like a mountain range that somebody decided to build, so wide that the old riders swore a 4-horse chariot could turn a full circle on top of them and never touch the edge. Then the gate, deep blue glazed brick, covered in golden bulls and long-necked dragons catching the last of the light. You pass beneath it, and the city does not end. Streets, temples, canals, gardens standing in the air. And above all of it, a tower climbing the sky in stage after stage, as if the people here were trying to knock, politely, on the door of heaven. This is Babylon. You already know its name. You have known it your whole life without anyone ever teaching it to you. It is the tower that reached too high, the garden that hung in the air, the great city of gold and sin that every prophet warned about and every poet quietly dreamed of. 3 of the world's religions took this one city and turned it into a symbol of paradise, and of everything that goes wrong when people build too proudly. But underneath the symbol there was a real place, real streets, real people walking home in the evening past bakeries and boatyards and the smell of the river. For a while, the most advanced city on earth, built by a king who wanted to make something the gods themselves would stop and look at. Tonight we walk into it while it still stands. Hello and welcome to Quiet History. This is a channel for the hour before sleep. One long, true story told slowly, calm enough to drift off inside of. There is nothing here you need to stay awake for, so let it come to you gently. If these quiet nights help you, a like and a subscribe are what keep them coming. You can tap one now while your hands are still awake and then set the phone aside for the night. Tonight we are going to Babylon. The Babylon you are picturing right now is probably the wrong one. Not the city of the paintings with its impossible towers and its wickedness lit up in gold. The real one was made of mud and river water on a flat plain between 2 rivers, in the country we now call Iraq. The place where, as far as anyone can tell, the city itself was more or less invented. We are going to walk through it at the height of its power, under a king named Nebuchadnezzar. We will stand at the Blue Gate and inside the temples and beneath the great tower that the world would remember wrongly as the Tower of Babel. We will go looking for the famous gardens that hung in the air, and I will tell you honestly whether they were ever really there. And we will follow the city all the way to the strange quiet night it was taken, without much of a fight at all. One thing before we begin. A great deal of what people say about Babylon is exaggerated, and some of it was invented on purpose by people who hated it. So part of what we are doing tonight is separating the city that actually existed from the city that everyone else needed to believe in. That, in the end, is the better story. So settle in. Turn the lights down low. We are going back about 2,500 years to the banks of the Euphrates, to the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. Chapter 1. The Land Between the Rivers. Before there was a Babylon, there was mud. I want to start there, with the mud, because everything about this city begins with it, and because it is the one part of the story that never makes it into the paintings. Picture a flat land in the south of what is now Iraq. Not desert exactly, though the desert is never far. A wide, low plain, hot and bright, with two great rivers running down through it toward the sea. In the west, the Euphrates. In the east, the Tigris. The Greeks gave the country a name that simply described where it sat: Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. It is not, at first glance, a place you would choose. There is almost no stone. There is almost no timber. In the summer, the heat sits on the plain like a hand pressing down, and the rivers themselves are not gentle, reliable things. They flood hard in the spring when the snow melts far away in the mountains, and they flood at the wrong time for the crops, and some years they change their course entirely and leave a town that used to sit on a riverbank sitting instead in the dust, wondering what it did wrong. And yet this unpromising plain is where it happened, where human beings first gathered in numbers large enough that we can honestly use the word city. Not a big village, a city, with thousands of people who did not know each other, living side by side, fed by grain they did not grow themselves. Why here of all places? Because of the one thing the plain did have. When you tamed those difficult rivers, when you dug the channels and raised the banks and learned to let the water out onto the fields in the right amount at the right time, this flat brown nothing became one of the most fertile places on earth. The silt the floods carried down was rich beyond anything. Plant grain in it, water it carefully, and it gave back more than the people who planted it could eat. And that surplus, that little bit extra, is the seed of everything that follows. Because when a farmer can grow more than his family needs, something new becomes possible. Somebody else does not have to farm. Somebody can spend his days making pots instead, or working metal, or keeping records, or praying on everyone's behalf, and be fed by the grain the farmer grew. That is the whole quiet miracle underneath the ancient world. Full stomachs and time. Out of that surplus came the first cities, more than 1,000 years before Babylon was anything at all. Cities with names most people have never heard. Uruk, Ur, Eridu. Cities built by a people called the Sumerians, who did something in these centuries that changed the human race more than almost anything before or since. They learned to write. It did not begin as poetry. It began, as so much of civilization does, as accounting. A temple needed to keep track of how much grain came in and how much went out, how many sheep, how many jars of oil, who owed what to whom. And so someone began pressing marks into wet clay with the cut end of a reed, little wedge-shaped marks. We call the writing cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. Clay, it turns out, is close to immortal. Paper burns and rots. Clay, once it dries, and especially once a fire hardens it, simply lasts. So while the great libraries of later ages have crumbled to nothing, the shopping lists and tax records and school exercises of Mesopotamia have come down to us in the hundreds of thousands, buried in the mounds, waiting. We know the name of a Sumerian who complained in writing about a delivery of low-quality copper 38 centuries ago. That is the kind of thing clay preserves. Hold on to that image of writing pressed into river mud, because it matters for Babylon in a way that is easy to miss. This was already, by the time our story begins, one of the oldest civilizations on the planet. Babylon was not the beginning of anything. Babylon was an heir. It inherited a way of life and a way of writing and a set of gods that were already ancient. When we finally walk into the great city, we are not walking into the dawn of the world. We are walking in near the end of a very long afternoon. And for a long time, Babylon was nobody. A small town on a minor stretch of the Euphrates, overshadowed by older, grander neighbors. If you had stood on the plain 4,000 years ago and pointed at the towns that would matter, you would not have pointed at Babylon. you would have been wrong, but you would not have been unreasonable. Because the thing that lifted Babylon out of the ordinary was not its position, or its rivers, or its walls. Not yet. It was a man. A king with a long reign and a longer memory, who did something no ruler in the region had quite done before, and put his name on it so firmly that we are still saying it today. His name was Hammurabi. Chapter 2. The First Babylon. Hammurabi came to the throne of Babylon around the year 1792 before the Common Era, almost 4,000 years ago. I want you to sit with that number for a second because it is easy to let these dates slide past. When Hammurabi was king, the pyramids of Egypt were already ancient. They had been standing for 600 or 700 years. Rome would not exist for more than 1,000 years. Everything you think of as the classical world, Greece, Athens, the philosophers, all of it, is closer in time to us than it is to Hammurabi. He is deep, deep back. And still, we know his name as if he lived down the road. When he inherited it, Babylon was a middling kingdom among many. Mesopotamia in his day was a patchwork of rival cities, each with its own king, its own god, its own walls, all of them circling one another warily, making alliances and breaking them, the way small powers always do when there is no large one to keep the peace. Hammurabi was patient. That is the first thing to understand about him. For the first decades of his reign, he mostly kept his head down. He strengthened his city, built up its walls and its temples, dug canals, and waited. He signed treaties with the stronger kingdoms around him and kept them more or less until keeping them stopped being useful. And then, late in his life, when he was already an old man by the standards of the age, he moved. In a burst of campaigns over just a few years, he turned on his neighbors one by one, and he beat them. And for the first time in a very long time, a single king ruled almost the whole of Mesopotamia from a single throne. And the throne was in Babylon. It did not last. We should be honest about that up front, because it is part of the pattern we are going to see again and again tonight. The empire Hammurabi built came apart within a generation or two of his death. His son held some of it, his grandson held less. These early Mesopotamian empires were fragile things, held together by the strength and the reputation of one man, and when the man was gone, the pieces drifted apart again. So if Hammurabi's empire fell so quickly, why do we remember him at all? Why is his the one name from this whole distant age that has survived into ordinary knowledge? Because of a stone. Late in his reign, Hammurabi had a great pillar of hard black stone carved and set up in public. It stands taller than a man, a smooth dart finger of rock, and it is covered top to bottom in cuneiform. Nearly 300 laws set down in careful lines. At the top, carved in relief, the king stands before a seated god, receiving the authority to rule and to judge. We call it the Code of Hammurabi, and it is one of the most famous objects to survive from the ancient world. Now, there is a myth about it that I need to clear away, because you have almost certainly heard the phrase, an eye for an eye. People say that as if it were the whole of the code and as if it were nothing but cruelty. If you take my eye, the law takes yours. Harsh, primitive, brutal. But look closer, and it is stranger and more thoughtful than that. First, the eye for an eye rule only applied between men of equal rank. If a nobleman blinded another nobleman, yes, he could lose his own eye. But if he blinded a commoner, he paid a fine in silver. The punishment depended entirely on who you were and who you hurt, which tells you a great deal about how carefully layered that society was, and not much of it comfortable to modern ears. But here is the part that actually matters, and that gets lost. The whole point of writing the law down, in public, on a stone that anyone could go and see, was to take the law out of the hands of any single judge or official and fix it in place. Before this, a ruling depended on the mood of whoever was judging. After this, in principle, there was a standard, something a person could point to. The stone says the penalty is this, not whatever you decide today. That is a genuinely enormous idea. The idea that power should be bound by a written rule that even the powerful have to acknowledge. We are still, 4,000 years later, arguing about how to make that idea actually work. Hammurabi did not invent justice, and his code is full of things that would horrify us. But the instinct behind that black stone, to lift the law up out of the dirt of daily favor and set it somewhere everyone could see it, runs in a straight line down to every courtroom in the world. And notice where he placed himself, at the top of the stone, not above the god, in front of the god, receiving. The message is careful. The king does not make the law by his own strength. He receives it from heaven, and he answers to heaven for it. Babylon's kings would repeat that posture for the rest of the city's history. We will see it again, most spectacularly, in a strange and beautiful ceremony held every New Year, where the most powerful man in the world was slapped across the face until he wept. But that is a long way ahead of us yet. For now, hold on to the stone and the old patient king who raised it. Because after Hammurabi died, Babylon did what Babylon would always do. It fell, and then it waited. Chapter 3: 1,000 Years in the Middle. Here is something the paintings never tell you. Between the Babylon of Hammurabi and the Babylon of the Blue Gate and the Hanging Gardens, the Babylon that the whole world would remember, there is a gap of more than 1,000 years. 1,000 years. That is longer than the time between us and the first Norman kings of England. A vast, dim stretch of history in which Babylon rose and fell and rose again, was conquered and freed and conquered once more, and somehow, through all of it, refused to disappear. I am not going to walk you through every twist of those 1,000 years, because most of them are the kind of detail that belongs in a scholar's footnote, not in a story you are trying to fall asleep to. But I want to give you the shape of it, because the shape tells you something important about this city, something that the gold and the towers can hide. Not long after Hammurabi's line weakened, a raiding army came down out of the north and west from a people called the Hittites, whose own empire we have visited on this channel before. They struck deep into Mesopotamia, reached Babylon, sacked it, and then, strangely, simply left. They did not want to hold it. They had come a long way. They took what they could carry, including the statue of the city's god, and they went home. It was less a conquest than a very long and violent robbery. Into the confusion that followed came another people, the Kassites, who came down from the eastern mountains and settled and, in time, took the throne. And here is the thing that I find genuinely moving about Babylon, the thing that comes up again and again. The Kassites were outsiders, foreigners, conquerors, and what did they do once they held the city? They became Babylonian. They kept the old gods. They kept the old language for their temples and their poetry, even though they spoke something else at home. They rebuilt the shrines, restored the statue of the god that the Hittites had carried off, and ruled for something like 4 centuries, longer than any native dynasty ever had, presiding over a long, stable, mostly peaceful age that the later Babylonians look back on almost fondly. This is the first appearance of a pattern we are going to see over and over tonight, right up to the last chapter. Babylon was so old, so prestigious, so heavy with the authority of the past, that again and again the people who conquered it ended up being absorbed by it. The city took them. You could break down its walls and burn its temples and sit a foreign king on its throne, and within a generation or two, that foreign king would be restoring those same temples and calling himself the beloved of Babylon's gods, because that was where legitimacy lived. To rule Babylon, you had to become Babylonian. The place was, in a strange way, stronger than any army that took it. But there was another power rising in these centuries to the north, up the Tigris, and it did not want to be absorbed. It wanted to rule. Assyria. If Babylon was the ancient, cultured, sacred old city of the south, all temples and scholarship and long memory, then Assyria was its harder, colder, more frightening cousin in the north. The Assyrians built the most formidable war machine the world had yet seen, an empire held together by iron and terror, and we will give them their own night on this channel one day because they deserve it. For now, what matters is this. For centuries, Babylon lived in Assyria's shadow, sometimes as an ally, often as a rebellious, resentful subject. The Assyrian kings could not quite decide what to do with Babylon, because Babylon was a problem no army could really solve. They revered it. That is the strange part. Even the Assyrians, who could be almost unbelievably brutal, held Babylon's gods and Babylon's ancient prestige in something close to awe. Some Assyrian kings took the city gently, careful not to damage its temples, and had themselves crowned as its rightful lord, wanting the blessing of its old authority. And then one of them lost his patience. Around the year 689 before the Common Era, after one rebellion too many, an Assyrian king named Sennacherib did the thing that even the Assyrians had mostly held back from doing. He decided to erase Babylon. His own account, carved in stone, is chilling in its thoroughness. He says he tore down the temples and the walls and the houses and threw the rubble into the canals, and then let the river in over the ruins, so that the very site of the city would become a marsh, and no one would ever be able to find where it had stood. He wanted it gone, not defeated, gone, unremembered. And here we arrive at the heart of what this city is. Because you already know that he failed. You know the name Babylon, you have known it your whole life. Sennacherib, the great king who tried to wipe it from the earth, is a footnote most people have never heard. The city he tried to drown outlived him, outlived his empire, and became one of the most famous names in human history. Within a few years, the Assyrians themselves, horrified at what their own king had done to a holy city, began to rebuild it. You cannot, it turns out, simply delete Babylon. It is an idea as much as a place, and ideas do not drown. But the rebuilt city was still, for now, under Assyria's thumb. The old resentment was still there, banked down like a fire under ash. And soon, in the far south, in the marshes where the rivers meet the sea, a man was rising who would finally fan that fire into a blaze, throw off Assyria forever, and set the stage for the greatest Babylon of them all. His name was Nabopolassar, and his son would be the man the whole world remembers. Chapter 4. The Rise of the New Babylon. Nabopolassar is not a household name, and that is a small injustice, because he did the hard part. We are not entirely sure where he came from. He describes himself in one inscription with an unusual humility for a king as a nobody, a son of nobody. He may have been a governor or a general or a chieftain from the marshland tribes of the Deep South. What we know for certain is that in the last decades of the 7th century before the Common Era, with the Assyrian Empire beginning to strain and crack under its own enormous weight, this man raised the south of Mesopotamia in revolt, declared himself king in Babylon, and set out to do what no one had managed in centuries: to break Assyria completely. It took him years, and he did not do it alone. Assyria was still terrifying, still the greatest military power in the world, and one rebellious king in the south could not topple it by himself. So Nabopolassar found allies. To the east, in the mountains of what is now Iran, there was a rising people called the Medes, who had their own reasons to hate the Assyrians and their own hard cavalry. Nabopolassar made common cause with them, sealed it in the old way with a royal marriage, and together, from the south and the east, the two of them closed in on the Assyrian heartland. In the year 612 before the Common Era, the allied armies came to the walls of Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, the city that had ruled the Near East by fear for generations. And they took it. They broke it open and burned it and left it in ruins so complete that within 200 years, when a Greek army marched past the spot, they did not even realize a world capital had once stood there. When the prophet Nahum, in the Bible, gloats over the fall of Nineveh, this is the moment he is celebrating. The most feared city on earth, gone in a season. Think about what that meant standing in Babylon. The shadow that had lain over the city for centuries, the northern power that had humbled it and once even tried to erase it, was simply gone, wiped away. And into the vacuum it left, Babylon stepped, and for the first time in over 1,000 years, since the days of Hammurabi himself, Babylon was not a subject or a shadow, but the center of an empire, master of the whole fertile crescent from the Persian Gulf to the edge of Egypt. Nabopolassar had won the war, but he was old now, and the work of building the peace and the city would fall to the son he had raised to command his armies. A young man, sharp and ambitious and tireless, who had already proved himself a formidable general in his father's campaigns. His name, in the Babylonian tongue, was something like Nabu-kuduri-Usur, which means, roughly, "May the god Nabu protect my firstborn son." We do not say it that way. We say it the way it came down to us through the Hebrew Bible and then through Greek and Latin. Nebuchadnezzar. He took the throne around 605 before the Common Era, and he would hold it for more than 40 years. And in those 4 decades, he would take the city his father had freed and turn it into the wonder of the world. Chapter 5. The King Who Wanted to Be Remembered. Most great conquerors want to be remembered for their battles. Nebuchadnezzar fought plenty of them, and won most, and we will come to the most famous and most terrible of his campaigns later tonight. But that is not in the end what he was proudest of. That is not what he spent his 40 years and his empire's fortune on. He wanted to be remembered as a builder. This is one of the genuine surprises of the historical record, and it is worth pausing on. We have a great many inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar, far more than for most ancient kings, and if you read through them expecting the usual royal boasting about slaughtered enemies and burned cities, you will be surprised by how little of that there is. Assyrian kings filled their inscriptions with cruelty, with counts of the dead and descriptions of torment. Nebuchadnezzar's read, over and over, like the proud reports of a man renovating a house he loves. "This temple I rebuilt, this wall I raised higher." This gate I covered in glazed brick and made to shine. This shrine I restored for the god, more beautiful than it had ever been. He was, by the evidence of his own words, obsessed with the physical city, with making Babylon not just powerful, but beautiful, the most magnificent thing that human hands had ever assembled. And he had the means to do it. The empire his father had won brought in tribute from a dozen conquered lands. The trade of half the world flowed up and down the Euphrates. For 40 years, an almost unimaginable river of wealth flowed into one city, and Nebuchadnezzar poured nearly all of it into brick and glaze and gold and cedar, into temples and palaces and walls, into making Babylon into a statement that anyone who saw it would never forget. There is a small detail that tells you everything about the man. All over the ruins of Babylon, in the millions of bricks that made up its walls and temples and streets, archaeologists keep finding the same thing. Stamped into the clay before it was fired over and over and over is an inscription. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, provider of the temple, eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. His name on the bricks, not the great ceremonial ones on display, the ordinary structural bricks buried inside the walls where no one would ever see them. He stamped his name into the very bones of the city, into pieces of it that would only be read if the whole thing one day fell down and someone came digging. Which, of course, is exactly what happened. And so his wish came true in a way he could not have imagined. 26 centuries later, we pull his name out of the rubble, one brick at a time, precisely because he thought to write it where only ruin would reveal it. There is something almost unbearably human in that. A king so desperate to be remembered that he signed the inside of his own walls and was proved right, but only by the disaster he was trying to outlast. So let us do what he wanted. Let us look at what he built. Because for all the myth and exaggeration we are going to have to sort through, the core of it is true. For a while, Babylon really was the greatest city on earth. And it began, as every visitor's experience of it began, with the walls. Chapter 6: The Walls. Everyone who wrote about Babylon wrote about the walls first, and every one of them exaggerated. Our most famous source is a Greek historian named Herodotus, who wrote about a century after Nebuchadnezzar, and who is, depending on which scholar you ask, either the father of history or the father of tall tales, and honestly is usually a bit of both. Herodotus tells us the walls of Babylon were around 90 meters high and 25 meters thick, and formed a perfect square, each side more than 20 kilometers long, so that the whole city was a square nearly 90 kilometers around. He tells us there were 100 gates, all of solid bronze. He tells us the wall was so wide across the top that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on it. Almost none of these numbers survive contact with the actual ground. We have dug Babylon up. We know roughly how big it was and where its walls ran, and the reality, while still staggering for its age, is a good deal more human than Herodotus. The city was large, one of the largest in the world at the time, but it was not a 90-kilometer square. The walls were tall and immensely thick, but not the height of a 30-story building. This is the constant work of the night, and I want to keep doing it honestly with you, sorting the city that was from the city people needed to believe in. But here is the thing. When you strip away Herodotus's exaggerations, what is left is still one of the most formidable pieces of engineering in the ancient world. Because the walls of Babylon were not really a wall, they were a system. There was an outer wall and an inner wall, and often more than one line of each, run in parallel, with a gap between them wide enough in places to drive along. The bricks were bound with bitumen, the natural tar that seeps up out of the ground in that part of the world, which set them like stone and sealed them against the water. Outside the walls ran a deep moat, fed from the river, so that any attacker had to cross water under fire before he even reached the first wall, and then face a second, higher wall behind it if he somehow got over the first. And the whole thing was so thick that Herodotus's chariot story, absurd as it sounds, is pointing at something true. The tops of these walls were genuinely broad enough to be roadways. Soldiers could march along them. There were towers set at intervals, hundreds of them, so a defender was never far from a raised, protected firing position. To an ordinary traveler in the ancient world, coming across the flat plain and seeing this rise up ahead, mile after mile of it, glazed and towered and reflected in its own moat, the effect must have been close to unbelievable. This was a defensive work on a scale that simply did not exist elsewhere. It said, without a word, that the people inside had more wealth, more labor, and more confidence than anyone the traveler had ever met. The Greeks later made a list of the wonders of the world, the great sights a traveler ought to see before he died. And in some of the earliest versions of that list, the walls of Babylon are on it. Not the hanging gardens, which we will come to, and which have their own complicated story. The walls, the sheer, overwhelming fact of them. But walls are only the outside of a city. To actually go in, you had to pass through a gate. And the main gate of Babylon, the one that opened onto the grandest street in the world, was a thing so beautiful that when archaeologists found what was left of it, they did not just record it. They dug it up, packed it into crates, carried it across the world, and rebuilt it in a museum where you can still walk under it today. The gate was blue, and it belonged to a goddess. Chapter 7. The Blue Gate. Her name was Ishtar, the goddess of love and of war, which is a combination the Babylonians understood better than we sometimes do, and the great gate on the northern side of the city was hers. Try to see it as a traveler would have seen it, coming down off the walls and into the city proper. You have passed the moat and the outer defenses, and now the road funnels you toward a single towering gateway, and as you get close, you realize that the whole thing is blue. A deep, luminous, almost unreal blue, the color of the evening sky just before it goes to black. It was made of glazed brick. The Babylonians had learned to coat brick in a mineral glaze and fire it, so that it came out of the kiln with a hard, shining, colored surface that would not fade in the sun or wash away in the rain. The blue came, most likely, from a stone we call lapis lazuli, or from minerals that imitated it, and lapis was one of the most precious materials in the ancient world, carried thousands of miles from the mountains of Afghanistan. To face an entire monumental gate in that color was a statement of wealth almost beyond comprehension. It was like tiling a skyscraper in sapphire. And across that blue surface, in rows, marched animals, raised up out of the brick in molded relief, in gold and cream and white, so that they seemed to step forward out of the deep blue background. Bulls for the storm god, and a strange creature the Babylonians called the Mushhushu, a slender dragon with the front legs of a lion, the back legs of an eagle, a long scaled neck, and a forked tongue, sacred to Marduk, the great god of the city himself. Row upon row of them, bulls and dragons, striding forever along the walls of the gate, lit up blue and gold, watching everyone who passed beneath. You went through the Ishtar Gate and onto a street, and the street was the equal of the gate. It was called the Processional Way, and it ran straight through the heart of the city, and it too was walled on both sides in glazed brick, deep blue again, And along those walls, at the level of a walking man, there marched a parade of lions. 60 of them, or more, life-sized, white and yellow against the blue, snarling mid-stride, one after another, escorting you into the city. The lion was Ishtar's animal, and to walk that street was to walk a gauntlet of her sacred beasts, blue and gold above you, and blue and gold at your shoulder, all the way to the temples at the center. This was not decoration for its own sake. This street was built for a purpose, once a year, at the most important festival in the Babylonian calendar, when the statues of the gods themselves were carried in procession down this very road, out through the Blue Gate, to a special temple beyond the walls and back again. Everything about the street, the width of it, the color, the marching animals, was designed to make that one procession the most magnificent thing a human being could witness. The rest of the year, it was simply the grandest avenue in the world, and people walked their ordinary lives up and down it, past the lions, probably without looking up, the way we walk past cathedrals. Now, I told you the gate was carried off to a museum, and it was, and this is worth knowing because it is the reason we can speak about it with such confidence. In the early 20th century, a German archaeological team spent years excavating Babylon, and they found the shattered remains of the Ishtar Gate and the processional way, tens of thousands of pieces of glazed brick, and they shipped them back to Berlin, and there, painstakingly, they reassembled it. If you go to the Pergamon Museum today, you can walk under the Ishtar Gate, not a copy. The actual glazed bricks that Nebuchadnezzar's workers made, rebuilt to their original height, blue and gold, bulls and dragons and all. It is one of the strangest afterlives any building has ever had. A gate built to guard the entrance to the greatest city on earth now stands, reassembled, in a hall in northern Europe, 26 centuries and 3,000 miles from where its makers set it. People walk under it on a Tuesday afternoon on their way to see the next exhibit, mostly without knowing what they are looking at. So that is the gate and the street. But I have been putting something off because you have been waiting for it since the very start of the night. Somewhere inside these blue walls, according to legend, there was a garden. A garden that did not sit on the ground but hung in the air, green and impossible, watered somehow at the top of an artificial mountain in the middle of a desert plain. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the most famous garden in the history of the world. It is time we went looking for it, and I have to warn you now, gently, that the search does not end quite the way the stories promise. Chapter 8: The Gardens That May Never Have Existed. Everyone knows the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The story is always more or less the same, and it is lovely. Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, married a princess from the mountains, from Media, in the cool green highlands to the northeast. And she came down to Babylon, to the flat, hot, brown plain, and she was homesick. She missed the trees and the green hillsides of her home. And so the king, who loved her, built her a mountain, a great artificial hill, rising in terraces, planted with trees and flowers and hanging vines, watered by some ingenious hidden machine that lifted the river up to the top, so that from a distance it looked as though a green forested mountain had grown, impossibly, out of the desert city. A garden in the air, made of love for a girl who missed the hills. It is one of the most charming stories to come down to us from the ancient world. And I have to tell you, as gently as I can, that we do not actually know whether it is true. I do not mean that lightly, and I do not mean it to spoil anything. I mean it as the honest state of the evidence, which is stranger and more interesting than the legend. here is the problem. We have, as I have said, an enormous quantity of writing from Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, thousands of clay tablets, building inscriptions in which the king lists, in loving and exhausting detail, everything he built. Every temple, every wall, every gate, every restoration. He was, as we have seen, a man who could not stop recording his own construction projects. And in all of it, in all those thousands of tablets, in all of Nebuchadnezzar's proud and detailed accounts of everything he made, there is not one single word about a hanging garden. Nothing. The most famous garden in history, supposedly built by this king for his wife at enormous expense, and the king who stamped his name on the inside of ordinary bricks, never once mentions it. No Babylonian text does, not one. The gardens appear only in later Greek and Roman writers, none of whom ever saw Babylon in its glory, all of whom were writing centuries afterward, repeating and embellishing each other. That is a very strange silence. And it has left historians with a genuine puzzle and a few honest possibilities, and I want to lay them out for you because the not knowing is part of the truth of this city. The first possibility is simply that the gardens existed and the records were lost. Babylon is not fully excavated, and much of it is badly damaged, and much of what was written on perishable materials is gone. Absence of evidence is not proof of absence. Maybe the tablet that described the gardens is still in the ground or was ground to dust long ago. It is possible. The second possibility is that the gardens are a legend, pure and simple. A story that grew in the telling, in the Greek imagination, about a fabulously wealthy and exotic eastern city, until a marvel that never existed became one of its defining wonders. Cities attract legends the way tall buildings attract lightning, and Babylon attracted more than any city in history. Perhaps the garden in the air was always a dream. But there is a third possibility, and it is my favorite, because it is the kind of answer that only careful, patient scholarship could ever have found, and because it quietly solves the mystery in a way nobody expected. The gardens may have been real, but not in Babylon. There was another great city in Mesopotamia, up in the north, in Assyria, Nineveh, the very city we watched fall a few chapters ago. And a century before Nebuchadnezzar, an Assyrian king ruled there. A king who, in his own inscriptions, describes in careful detail a wonder he built. A great garden raised up on terraces beside his palace, planted with trees from many lands and, crucially, watered by an ingenious system of channels and screws and raised aqueducts that lifted water up from the river to the height of the garden. He even had it carved in relief on his palace walls, a hillside of terraced trees, with watercourses running through it. That king's name was Sennacherib, the very same king who tried to erase Babylon and drown it in the marsh. Some historians now think that the hanging gardens the Greeks marveled at were really Sennacherib's gardens at Nineveh, and that over the centuries, as memory blurred and Nineveh was forgotten, and Babylon became the byword for all Eastern wonder, the gardens simply migrated in the storytelling from the city that built it to the more famous city down the road. The wonder was real, the location was wrong. The most romantic story about Babylon may actually be a stolen memory of the city that hated it most. We do not know. I want to be clear about that. All three possibilities are still alive, and honest scholars still disagree, and anyone who tells you with certainty that the hanging gardens definitely did or definitely did not exist in Babylon is telling you more than the evidence allows. But sit with that third possibility for a moment as you drift, because it is the kind of irony that history specializes in. Sennacherib tried to wipe Babylon off the face of the earth, to erase its name forever. And if the scholars are right, then his single most beautiful creation, his terraced garden in the air, escaped his own ruined city and attached itself forever to the name of the city he tried to destroy. He wanted Babylon forgotten. Instead, his masterpiece became Babylon's most famous wonder, and his own name was the thing that slipped away. The city takes everything in the end, even from the man who tried to drown it. Chapter 9. The Tower. There is one more great structure we have to visit, and like the gardens, it lives a double life, half in fact and half in a story so powerful it swallowed the fact whole. The Tower of Babel. You know the story, even if you were never taught it, the same way you know the city's name. Once, the story goes, all people spoke a single language. And in their pride, they came to the plain of Shinar, which is to say Babylonia, and they said, "Let us build a tower with its top in the heavens and make a name for ourselves." And God, seeing this, was displeased at their arrogance and confused their language, so that they could no longer understand one another, and scattered them across the earth. And the tower was left unfinished, and the place was called Babel, because there God confused, in Hebrew Babal, the speech of all the world. It is one of the oldest and most resonant stories in the Western imagination, the tower that reached too high, human pride punished by division, and it is set explicitly here, in Babylon. So was there a tower? Yes, there was. And this is one of those cases where the real thing underneath the legend is almost as extraordinary as the legend itself. At the very heart of Babylon, near the great temple of Marduk, there stood a ziggurat. A ziggurat is a Mesopotamian temple tower, a massive stepped pyramid of mud brick built up in stages, each level smaller than the one below, with a shrine at the very top. They were among the oldest and most sacred structures in the whole civilization, going back thousands of years to those first Sumerian cities. The idea behind them was simple and beautiful. The gods lived in the heavens. A mountain reaches toward the heavens. So in a flat land with no mountains, you build one, an artificial holy mountain, and you put the god's shrine on top, closer to where he lives, a meeting place between earth and sky. The great ziggurat of Babylon had a name, Etemenanki. It means, more or less, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. And it was enormous. We can reconstruct its size fairly well from a surviving tablet that records its dimensions, and from the foundations that remain, and it rose in 7 great stages to a height of perhaps 90 meters, roughly the height of the walls the legends described, with a temple at its summit, reached by great staircases. It stood at the sacred center of the city, the highest thing for a very long way in every direction. Visible across the plain, a mountain of brick climbing into the sky in a land that had no mountains at all. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it and raised it higher and boasted about it, as he boasted about everything. He wanted, he said, to make its top rival the heavens. To make its top rival the heavens. Read that again and you can feel the old story pressing up against the real one. Here is a real king, in a real inscription, saying he built a tower to reach the sky. It is not hard to see how the Hebrew writers, who knew Babylon well, who were, as we will see, carried there as captives and lived in its shadow, looked at this staggering artificial mountain climbing toward heaven, in the middle of the proudest and most powerful city on earth, a city that had burned their temple and taken their people and turned it into a parable. A parable about pride and its punishment and the scattering of tongues. The tower was real. The meaning was theirs. And there is a final, quiet irony in it, the kind this city keeps producing. The story says the tower was never finished, left broken and abandoned, a monument to failed pride. And in the end, that is more or less what happened, though not for the reasons the story gives. Etemenanki was damaged, rebuilt, damaged again over the centuries. And later, long after Nebuchadnezzar, another conqueror came, meaning to restore it to its full glory, and he ordered it torn down first so it could be built up again grander than before. His workmen pulled the great tower to pieces, cleared the rubble, made ready to rebuild. And then the conqueror died, and the rebuilding never happened, and the greatest tower in the world was left as a vast, cleared, empty foundation, a scar on the plain where a mountain of brick had stood. The conqueror's name was Alexander the Great, but he is waiting for us near the end of the night, and we are not there yet. For now the tower still stands, climbing into the sky, and beneath it, all around it, a city of 250,000 people is going about its ordinary day. Let us go down from the heights, away from the gods and the kings and the wonders, and walk for a while in the streets. Chapter 10. A Day in Babylon. We have spent a long time now on the enormous things, the walls, the gate, the tower, the gardens that may or may not have hung in the air. But the city is not its monuments. A city is a few 100,000 people getting through a day. And one of the real gifts of Babylon, one of the things that clay gave us and stone never could, is that we know in astonishing detail how ordinary Babylonians actually lived, because they wrote it all down and the writing survived. So let us leave the processional way and turn off into the ordinary streets and see the city at the level of a person walking home. The first thing you would notice is that it is close. The Grand Avenue is wide and straight, but the ordinary streets behind it are narrow and winding, twisting between the blank outer walls of houses, barely wide enough for a loaded donkey. There are no windows on the street side mostly. A Babylonian house turned its back to the street and looked inward, onto a central courtyard open to the sky, where the family cooked and worked and where the light came in. From the street you saw only a plain mud brick wall and a wooden door. All the life of the house was hidden inside, around that courtyard. The houses were made of the same thing as everything else, mud brick. In a land with no stone and little wood, you built with what you had, and what you had was the river's own silt, shaped into bricks and dried in the fierce sun. It is a wonderful material, cool inside in the heat, cheap, endlessly renewable. It has only one weakness, and it is the weakness that would, in the end, undo the whole city. It melts. Not quickly, but surely. Rain wears it. Neglect returns it to the earth it came from. A mud brick house needs constant care to stay standing, and a mud brick house left alone slumps, within a few generations, back into a low mound of the very dirt it was made from. Hold on to that, because it is how this whole magnificent city eventually vanished. But not yet. Today the houses are kept and lived in and full. The streets would be loud and busy and smell of 100 things. Bread, above all, baking in clay ovens, because bread and beer were the twin staples of Mesopotamian life, both made from barley, and the Babylonians drank their beer thick through a straw to get past the floating husks. Fish from the river laid out in the market. The tar smell of bitumen, animals and their leavings, and the dust, and the smoke of cooking fires, and under it all, always, the wet green smell of the river and the canals. Because Babylon was a city of water as much as brick. The Euphrates ran straight through the middle of it, dividing it into two halves joined by a great bridge, and off the river ran a network of canals threading through the districts, carrying water for drinking and washing and irrigation, carrying boats and barges loaded with grain and brick and goods. A Babylonian was never far from moving water. It was the city's lifeblood, its highway, and its constant, patient enemy, always trying to flood, always needing to be managed. And in the markets and the courtyards and the little houses, ordinary people lived lives that are, across 26 centuries, startlingly recognizable. We know this because of the tablets. We have their contracts, thousands of them. Deeds for the sale of houses and fields and slaves. Marriage agreements spelling out exactly what the bride brought and what would happen to it if the marriage ended. Loans with interest and the disputes when the loans went bad. Wills. Apprenticeship contracts where a father bound his son to a craftsman to learn a trade for a set number of years with penalties written in if either side failed. We have a schoolboy's homework, the same lines of cuneiform copied over and over, getting neater down the tablet as the child got the hang of it. We have letters, one man writing to another about a business deal or a debt or a family quarrel, sometimes impatient, sometimes affectionate, occasionally furious. We have the complaint of a man who felt the temple official had cheated him. We have a mother writing to her son. None of this is the stuff of legend. There is no wonder in a marriage contract or a barley loan. And that is exactly why it is precious. Because it is the texture of an actual human life, lived out in full, in a real city 26 centuries ago, by people who worried about money and their children and their standing with the neighbors, exactly as we do. The kings and the gods and the towers are the parts we remember, but the marriage contracts are the parts that were actually lived. Behind every blank mud wall on those narrow streets, a whole life was going on, hidden around its courtyard, ordinary and complete. And woven through all of it, through the ordinary lives and the grand monuments alike, was religion. Not as a thing you did on one day a week, but as the very air the city breathed. To understand Babylon, you have to understand its gods. And above all, you have to understand the God who owned it. Chapter 11. The Gods. Babylon had many gods, as all the ancient world did. Gods of the sky and the storm, of the sun and the moon, of war and love, and wisdom and the grain. But above them all, at the head of the whole divine order, stood one God who had not always been so great, and whose rise to the top of heaven was, not by accident, exactly mirrored by the rise of his city on earth. His name was Marduk. In the oldest days, Marduk had been a minor god, a local deity of the unimportant town of Babylon. But as Babylon rose, so did Marduk, and the Babylonians told the story to explain and to justify his supremacy, one of the great myths of the ancient world, chanted every year at the most important festival in the calendar. It is a creation story, and it goes in brief like this. In the beginning there was only water, the fresh water and the salt mingled together, and out of them the first gods were born. But the older gods and the younger gods fell into conflict, and the great mother of the deep, a monstrous ocean goddess named Tiamat, rose up in fury to destroy her own children, breeding an army of dragons and monsters to do it. The gods were terrified. None of them dared face her. And so the young god Marduk stepped forward and made a bargain. He would fight the monster. But if he won, they would make him king over all the gods forever. They agreed, and Marduk went out and faced the chaos monster Tiamat, and in a tremendous battle he caught her in a net and drove the winds into her and killed her. And then he did something extraordinary. He split her vast body in two, and out of one half he made the sky, and out of the other half he made the earth, and from her waters he set the rivers running. And he put the stars and the moon and the sun in their courses, and he made human beings out of the blood of a defeated god, to do the work of the world and to serve the gods. Order made out of the body of chaos by the young god who dared to fight when no one else would. You can see straight away what the story is doing. It is a story about how the world was made, yes, but it is also transparently a story about why Marduk, and therefore Babylon, deserves to rule. He earned the kingship of heaven by facing the chaos no one else would face. And every year, the city acted this story out. The festival was called the Akitu, the Great New Year Festival, held in spring, and it lasted 11 or 12 days, and it was the beating heart of the Babylonian year. The creation myth was recited. The statues of the gods were brought together, and at the climax, the images of the gods were carried in a magnificent procession out through the Ishtar Gate, down the processional way, between the marching lions, out to a special temple beyond the city, and back again in a reenactment of the divine order of the cosmos, watched by the whole city. But there is one moment in the Akitu festival that I have wanted to tell you about since the very first chapter, and now we are finally here, because it is one of the most extraordinary rituals in the entire ancient world, and it turns everything you might assume about an all-powerful god-king upside down. At a certain point in the festival, the king of Babylon, the most powerful man in the world, master of an empire that stretched from the Gulf to the borders of Egypt, was brought into the temple of Marduk. And there the high priest took away from him everything that marked him as king: his crown, his ring, his scepter, the weapons of his office. Stripped of them, the king was made to kneel before the statue of the god. And then the priest struck him across the face, hard enough, the texts specify, that it should hurt, hard enough to bring tears. The king, kneeling, humiliated, had to declare to the god that he had not sinned, that he had not neglected the city, that he had not struck its people unjustly or let its temples fall into ruin. A negative confession. I have not done wrong by your city. And the priest, having heard it, would strike him again and pull his ears, and if, in that second blow, the king wept, it was taken as a good sign. It meant the god was pleased. If the king did not weep, it was an omen of disaster. Think about what that ceremony says. Once a year, in front of his god, the absolute monarch of Babylon was reminded, physically, painfully, that his power was not his own, that he held it on trust from Marduk on behalf of the city, and that he could be called to account for it, and struck, and made to weep, and made to swear that he had not abused the people in his care. The most powerful man in the world, slapped until he cried, and grateful for the tears. It is the same idea, isn't it, that we met on Hammurabi's stone at the very start of the night. The king does not own his power. He receives it and he answers for it. Babylon held on to that idea across 1,000 years and more, from the black stone of the law to the slap in the temple. Power is a trust, and even the greatest king kneels before something higher and swears he has not abused it. They were, in their way, wrestling with the oldest political question there is, the one we are still wrestling with. How do you bind the powerful? Babylon's answer was to make the king weep before his god once a year. It is not our answer, but it is not nothing. It is a people insisting, in the only language they had, that even the man at the very top is not above account. And speaking of looking upward, at things higher than kings, there is one more thing the Babylonians did. night after night for centuries, that outlasted their gods and their walls and their empire, and that still quietly shapes the way you tell the time and read your horoscope and measure a circle. They watched the sky, and they wrote down what they saw, and in doing so, almost without meaning to, they invented something new. Chapter 12. How Babylon Read the Sky. Every clear night, on the flat plain of Babylonia, the sky is enormous. There are no mountains to hide the horizon, no forests, little cloud for much of the year. The stars come down almost to the ground on every side, and the moon and the planets move against them in their slow, exact, endlessly repeating paths. The Babylonians watched all of it, obsessively, for centuries, and they did the one thing that turns watching into knowledge. They wrote it down. Every night in the temples, priests recorded what the sky was doing, where the moon was, when it rose and set, which planets were where against which stars, when there was an eclipse, when there was not. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation, they kept the records, and the records piled up into the longest run of continuous scientific observation the ancient world ever produced. Some of these sky diaries stretch across centuries, an unbroken chain of watchers, each adding to what the last had seen. Now, why did they do it? Here we have to be honest, because the answer is not what we would like it to be. They did not watch the sky out of pure curiosity about the universe. They watched it because they believed the sky was a message, that the gods wrote their intentions in the movements of the heavens, and that a king who could read the sky could know what was coming. An eclipse of the moon might mean the death of a king. The position of a planet might warn of a bad harvest or a war or a plague. Babylonian astronomy began as astrology, as the reading of omens in the service of the state. But here is the beautiful thing, the thing that happens sometimes in the history of knowledge. To predict the omens, they needed to predict the sky. And to predict the sky, they had to understand its patterns. And so, out of the desire to read the gods' intentions came real, hard, mathematical astronomy. Over the centuries, the Babylonians worked out the cycles. They discovered that eclipses repeat in a predictable rhythm, a cycle of about 18 years, so that once you know it, you can predict an eclipse before it happens. They tracked the wandering of the planets with such precision that they could forecast their positions far into the future using arithmetic of real sophistication. They were, by any honest measure, the world's first mathematical astronomers. The Greeks, who we usually credit with the birth of science, learned much of their astronomy from Babylon and knew it and said so. And they left us more than knowledge. They left us habits, buried so deep in daily life that we use them constantly without ever knowing where they came from. The Babylonians and the Sumerians before them counted not in tens, as we mostly do, but in 60s, a base 60 system. Nobody is entirely sure why, though 60 is a wonderfully convenient number, divisible cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and more, which makes it easy to split things into parts. And that ancient choice, made on the mud brick plain thousands of years ago, is still running underneath your day right now. Why are there 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour? Because of Babylon. Why are there 360 degrees in a circle? 60 times 6, because of Babylon. Every time you check the time, every time an engineer measures an angle, every time a ship takes a bearing, they are using a way of dividing things that was worked out by star-watching priests on the Euphrates and has simply never gone away. It survived the fall of the city, the fall of the empire, the fall of the gods themselves. Marduk is forgotten by all but historians. The way he counted the hours is used by every human being alive. And there is one more gift or curse, depending on how you feel about it. Watching the sky, the Babylonians divided the band of the heavens through which the sun and moon and planets move into 12 sections and named them after the constellations that sat in them. The ram, the bull, the twins, the lion, the scales, the scorpion. Does this list sound familiar? It should. It is the zodiac. The 12 signs that still fill the back pages of newspapers and the small talk of first dates were mapped out and named and tied to human fate by Babylonian astrologers reading the gods' intentions in the sky over the greatest city on earth. When someone tells you their star sign, they are, without the faintest idea of it, quoting Babylon. So there is the city at its height. Immense walls, a blue gate, a tower reaching for heaven, 250,000 people, a god who won his crown by fighting chaos, a king who wept before that god once a year, and priests who read the future in a sky whose mathematics we still use. For a few glorious decades under Nebuchadnezzar, this was the center of the world. The richest, largest, most learned, most magnificent city that human beings had yet built. But an empire is not only its capital, and Nebuchadnezzar was not only a builder, to pay for all this glory, to fill the city with tribute and the temples with gold. He was also, when he needed to be, a conqueror. And one of his conquests, far to the west, in a small and stubborn kingdom in the hills, would echo down the centuries far louder than the walls or the tower or the gardens ever did. Because among the peoples Nebuchadnezzar broke and carried back to Babylon was one that would never forget it, and would write about it, and whose writing would become the most widely read book in the history of the world. Chapter 13. The Exile. Far to the west of Babylon, past the desert, up in the dry hills near the coast, there was a small kingdom called Judah. Its capital was a hill town called Jerusalem, with a temple its people believed was the dwelling place of their one God. Judah was a minor kingdom, poor and stubborn, caught, as small kingdoms always are, between greater powers. And in Nebuchadnezzar's day, the greater power pressing on it was Babylon. Judah's kings were supposed to be loyal vassals of Babylon, paying tribute, keeping quiet. But they kept hoping that Egypt, the other great power in the region, would back them if they rebelled. And so they rebelled. And Egypt did not come, or did not come in time, and Babylon did. It happened in stages, and it got worse each time. First, Nebuchadnezzar came and took the city and installed a puppet king and carried off some of the leading people to Babylon, along with the treasures of the temple. When that puppet king rebelled anyway, Nebuchadnezzar came back, and this time he was done being patient. In the year 587 or 586, before the Common Era, after a long and terrible siege, Babylon took Jerusalem and destroyed it. They broke down its walls, they burned the palaces, and they destroyed the temple, the great temple, the one the Judeans believed their God himself had chosen to live in. It was torn apart and burned, and its sacred treasures carried away. And then the Babylonians took a large part of the population, the leaders, the skilled, the priests, the royal family, and marched them east across the whole width of the Fertile Crescent to Babylon to live as exiles in the shadow of the ziggurat. This is the event the Bible calls the Babylonian captivity, or the exile, and for the people it happened to, it was a catastrophe almost beyond imagining. Not just the military defeat, a theological earthquake. Their God's own house had been destroyed. Their God's own people had been dragged away to a foreign land, to the very heart of the empire that had done it. How could their God have let this happen? Was the God of Babylon simply stronger? Had their own God abandoned them or been defeated? the astonishing thing, the thing that changed history, is how they answered that question. They did not conclude that their God was weak or beaten. They concluded the opposite. They decided that their God had allowed this, had used Babylon as an instrument to punish them for their own failures, and that he was therefore not merely the God of one hill kingdom, but the Lord of all history, of Babylon itself, of the whole earth, powerful enough to raise up an empire and to bring it down again. In exile, in defeat, in the greatest disaster of their history, the religion did not break, it deepened. Much of what became the Hebrew Bible was gathered, shaped, and written down by these exiles and their heirs, wrestling with what had happened to them, and out of that wrestling came ideas about a single universal God, and about history as something with meaning and direction, that would flow into Judaism, and then into Christianity, and then into Islam, and shape the inner life of a very large part of the human race, right down to today. And the exiles remembered Babylon with a bitter, unforgettable clarity. There is a song, a psalm that comes out of this experience, and it is one of the most haunting things in all of ancient literature. By the rivers of Babylon it begins, "There we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. We hung our harps upon the willows, for there our captors demanded of us songs, and mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.'" And the exiles answer, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" That is the voice of a people sitting beside the canals of Babylon, homesick, defeated, refusing to perform their sacred songs for the amusement of their conquerors. It was written 26 centuries ago beside the very canals we have been walking along all night, and people still sing it and set it to music and feel it, without always knowing that the strange land it mourns is the shining city we have been exploring. So Babylon enters the memory of the Western world twice over, and in opposite ways. It is the city of wonders, the gardens and the gate and the tower. And it is the city of exile, the great oppressor, the destroyer of the temple, the whore of Babylon that the last book of the Bible would curse. Paradise and sin, wonder and wickedness, the dream and the nightmare, all fixed forever on the same mud brick city on the Euphrates. That double memory, more than any wall or any garden, is why the world could never let Babylon go. The exiles wept by the rivers and waited, and they did not have to wait as long as they feared, because Babylon's own glory was already, though no one inside it seemed to notice, running out of time. Nebuchadnezzar would die, full of years and full of monuments, and the men who came after him were not his equal. And out to the east, beyond the mountains, a new power was rising, quiet and patient and immense, under a king who would prove to be one of the most remarkable conquerors in all of history. The last night of the free city of Babylon was coming, and the strangest part of the whole story is how quietly it came. Chapter 14. The Writing on the Wall. Nebuchadnezzar died around 562 before the Common Era, after more than 40 years on the throne, in a city he had made into the wonder of the world, and almost at once the trouble began. His son was murdered within a couple of years. The next king lasted only a few years more. Thrones changed hands through assassination and intrigue, the way they so often do when a towering figure dies and lesser men scramble over what he leaves behind. And in the confusion, power came at last to a man named Nabonidus, and Nabonidus was, to put it gently, a strange king to have at the end of an empire. He was not, it seems, a bad administrator, but he was a religious eccentric, and in a deeply traditional city, that is a dangerous thing to be. Nabonidus was devoted, above all, not to Marduk, the great god of Babylon, but to the moon god, Sin, worshipped especially in a city far to the north. He promoted the moon god's cult, poured resources into it, and seems to have neglected, even slighted, the worship of Marduk and the great festival of the New Year. And then he did something almost inexplicable. He left Babylon. He went away far to the south into the Arabian desert to a place called Taima, and he stayed there for years, 10 years by some accounts, leaving his son to hold the capital in his absence. For a city whose entire identity was bound up in its god and its king and the great yearly festival where the two met, this was close to a disaster. The New Year festival, the Akitu, could not be properly held without the king. Year after year, the most important ceremony in Babylon was cancelled or diminished because the king was off in the desert worshipping the wrong god. The priests of Marduk, the most powerful men in the city, grew to hate him. The people grew uneasy. The heart of the city's religious life had stopped beating, and everyone could feel it. That son, left holding Babylon while his father wandered in the desert, is remembered by a name you may know from one of the most famous scenes in the Bible, Belshazzar. The book of Daniel tells the story, and it is unforgettable. Belshazzar the prince holds a great feast, 1,000 of his lords around him, wine flowing. And in his arrogance he calls for the sacred vessels, the gold and silver cups that Nebuchadnezzar had carried off from the temple in Jerusalem. And he and his lords and his wives drink their wine from these holy vessels and praise their gods of gold and silver and stone. And in that very hour, the story says, the fingers of a human hand appear out of nothing and write on the plaster of the palace wall, and the king watches the hand as it writes, and the color drains from his face, and his knees knock together in terror. No one can read the writing. Finally, they send for the exiled Daniel, who reads it. 4 words. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And Daniel gives the king their meaning. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. That very night, the story ends, Belshazzar was killed and the kingdom passed to another. From that story, we get a phrase we still use for any sign of coming doom: the writing on the wall. Now, I have to be honest with you here, the way I have tried to be all night. The story in Daniel was written down long after the events, and it is not history in the way a chronicle is. It gets details wrong. It calls Belshazzar the son of Nebuchadnezzar when he was really the son of Nabonidus. It has some of its kings confused. It is a story with a message, a story about pride and judgment, not a police report. But underneath the miracle, the bones of it are real, and that is what gives the legend its uncanny power. There really was a Belshazzar. He really was holding Babylon while his father was absent. The king of Babylon really had lost the favor of his own city's priests and people. The empire really was in its final hours. And out to the east, the Medes and the Persians really were coming, exactly as the writing on the wall foretold. The story dressed the fall of Babylon in a miracle, but the fall itself, the sense of a great and arrogant kingdom whose time had quietly run out, whose doom was already written and only needed reading, that was completely true. The hand was a legend, the verdict was real. Babylon had been weighed and found wanting, and its last night had come. And it came, when it came, more quietly than anyone in that feasting hall could have dreamed. Chapter 15. The night the city fell. The power rising in the east was Persia, and its king was a man named Cyrus, whom later ages would call Cyrus the Great, and who earned a name. In a single astonishing generation, Cyrus had risen from the king of a minor people to the master of the largest empire the world had yet seen. He had swallowed the Medes, Babylon's old allies. He had conquered fabulously wealthy Lydia in the west and its famous king Croesus. His empire now stretched from the edge of the Greek world to the mountains of Central Asia, and it surrounded Babylon on almost every side. There was really only one great prize left in that part of the world, the oldest, richest, most magnificent city of all. And in the year 539 before the Common Era, Cyrus came for it. You would expect the fall of Babylon to be the climax of the night. The greatest city on earth, with the greatest walls ever built, that double ring of towering brick, the moat, the blue gate, besieged and stormed in fire and blood. That is how these stories are supposed to end. That is not how it happened. And the way it actually happened is stranger and quieter and tells you more about the real state of the city than any battle could. Babylon fell, essentially, without a fight. We have several accounts, and they differ in the details, and I will give you the honest range of them. The Greek historians Herodotus and later Xenophon tell a dramatic story. They say that Cyrus, unable to breach those enormous walls, resorted to a brilliant piece of engineering. The Euphrates, remember, ran straight through the middle of the city, in under the walls. So Cyrus, the story goes, had his army dig channels to divert the river upstream into a great basin, lowering the water in the riverbed until it was shallow enough to wade. And then, on a night when the Babylonians were distracted by a festival, drinking and feasting, his soldiers marched into the city along the drained riverbed, under the walls, and took Babylon before it even knew it was under attack. You can hear the echo of Belshazzar's feast in that, the city drinking while its doom walked in under the wall. It is a wonderful story. Whether it is true in its details, we cannot be sure. But we have another source, closer to the event, that tells a plainer and in some ways more damning tale. The Babylonians themselves left records, and so did the Persians. And what they suggest is that the city did not so much fall as open its gates. That the priests of Marduk, who hated Nabonidus for neglecting their god, and the people, weary of a king who had abandoned them, simply welcomed Cyrus in. That there was a battle out in the countryside which Nabonidus lost, and that after it, Babylon itself surrendered, and Cyrus entered the greatest city on earth, not as a destroyer, but carefully, deliberately, as a liberator. And this is where Cyrus reveals the political genius that made him great. He did not sack Babylon, he did not burn its temples or drag its people into exile. He did the opposite, and he did it brilliantly. He walked into the role that the city had always demanded of its conquerors, the role we have watched foreign king after foreign king step into all night long. He became Babylonian. He presented himself as the chosen one of Marduk, come to restore the god's proper worship that the wicked Nabonidus had neglected. He left a famous inscription, the Cyrus cylinder, in which he speaks as a devoted servant of Marduk, restorer of the temples, friend of the people, and it reads exactly like the words of a native Babylonian king. He took the hand of the god Marduk in the temple, the ritual gesture by which a true king of Babylon received his crown. The city, in other words, did to Cyrus exactly what it had done to the Kassites, and the Assyrians, and everyone else. It absorbed him. He conquered Babylon, and Babylon, in the same motion, made him one of its own. And Cyrus did one more thing, and it is the reason he is remembered so warmly in a certain very famous book. He let the exiles go home. The Judeans, weeping by the rivers of Babylon, were told they could return to Jerusalem, and rebuild their temple, and Cyrus even returned the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had carried off. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus, a Persian king who worshipped other gods entirely, is called the Anointed of the Lord, the Shepherd, the instrument of God's deliverance. It is an extraordinary honor for a foreign conqueror, and he earned it by understanding something Nebuchadnezzar's harsher predecessors never had: that you can rule people more cheaply by letting them keep their gods than by smashing them. So the greatest city on earth changed hands on a single night with barely a sword drawn. The walls that had awed the world were never even truly tested. Babylon was not defeated so much as it quietly decided that its king was not worth defending, opened its gates, and carried on. The buildings still stood. The gardens, if they existed, still hung in the air. The towers still climbed toward heaven. The markets opened the next morning. To an ordinary Babylonian, walking to buy bread the day after the fall, very little had changed except the name of the man on the throne. But something had changed, even if no one could see it yet. Babylon was no longer the center of anything. It was now one city, however grand, in someone else's empire. Its long, long life as a capital of the world was over. And though it would take centuries, from this quiet night onward, the greatest city the ancient world had ever built began, very slowly, to fade. Chapter 16: Under New Masters. For the first years under Persia, you would hardly have known that anything was wrong. Cyrus had been careful, and his successors, mostly, kept up the care. Babylon remained one of the jewels of the Persian Empire, perhaps its single greatest city, a center of administration, of trade, of learning. The Persian kings held court there for part of the year. Its temples still functioned, its priests still watched the sky, its craftsmen still made the glazed brick that no one else in the world could match. If you had walked its streets a generation after the fall, you would have found a city still busy, still rich, still proud of its immense past. But the center of gravity had moved, and slowly everyone came to feel it. The great decisions were no longer made in Babylon. They were made far to the east, in the Persian heartland, in cities like Susa and Persepolis, and Babylon, for all its size and splendor, was now a provincial capital, a magnificent one, but a province all the same. And the city did what proud, formerly great places do when they are ruled from somewhere else. It grew restless. Twice, early in Persian rule, Babylon rose in revolt, declared its own kings, tried to shrug off the empire and be its own master again. And twice it was put down, the second time hard. The Persian king Xerxes, the same Xerxes who would later march against Greece and be turned back at the pass we told you about on the night of Thermopylae, lost patience with rebellious Babylon much as the Assyrians once had. After the second revolt, the sources suggest he came down heavily. Some accounts say he damaged the great temple of Marduk, carried off or melted down the god's sacred golden statue, that ancient image at the very center of the city's identity, the one every true king had to take by the hand to be crowned. If that is true, and the details are debated, then it was a wound to the soul of the city deeper than any breach in the walls, because without the statue of Marduk, the great ceremony could no longer happen. The king could no longer take the god's hand. The New Year festival, already faltering, lost its living heart. The engine that had turned foreign conquerors into Babylonians for 1,000 years began, finally, to stop. Still, the city endured. Cities like this do not die quickly. It endured through the rest of the Persian centuries, a little diminished each generation, its walls a little less maintained, its temples a little poorer, but still unmistakably Babylon. Still the largest city most people had ever seen, still watching the sky, still keeping its records in cuneiform on clay, in a script and a language that were by now growing old-fashioned, kept alive mostly by the priests and the scholars like a sacred tongue. And then, 200 years after Cyrus, out of the west, moving faster than any army the world had ever seen, came a young man who would give Babylon one last, brilliant, doomed moment at the center of history. He came out of Greece, or from its rough northern edge. He had already destroyed the Persian Empire that had ruled Babylon for 2 centuries. He was, by any reckoning, the most successful conqueror who has ever lived. And when he looked at the map of the enormous world he had just won, and asked himself where the capital of it should be, where the center of his new empire that stretched from Greece to India ought to sit, he gave an answer that would have delighted Nebuchadnezzar. He chose Babylon. Chapter 17. Alexander Dies here. Alexander of Macedon, whom the world calls Alexander the Great, first came to Babylon as a conqueror in the autumn of 331 before the Common Era, fresh from smashing the Persian army at the Battle of Gaugamela, not far to the north. And Babylon, true to its whole long history, did to Alexander exactly what it had done to everyone else. It opened its gates. There was no siege, no battle for the city. The Persian governor came out and surrendered it, and its people and its treasury, and Alexander entered the greatest city in the world in triumph, riding down a road strewn, the sources say, with flowers, past altars smoking with incense, welcomed like a liberator. And Alexander, young as he was, understood the city's magic at once. He did not come as a destroyer. He gave orders that the temples were to be restored. Most of all, he commanded that the great ziggurat Etemenanki, the tower reaching toward heaven, damaged and decayed after 2 centuries of neglect under the Persians, was to be rebuilt to its full ancient glory. He wanted to be the king who raised the Tower of Babylon back into the sky. For that, the old structure first had to be pulled down so that it could be built anew from clean foundations. And so Alexander's men and the labor of Babylon tore down what remained of the great tower and cleared away the rubble, a colossal task that took thousands of workers a very long time. They leveled it and cleared the ground and made ready to begin the new, greater tower that Alexander had promised. And then Alexander went away east into Persia and beyond to India and the ends of the known world on the campaigns that made him a legend. And the rebuilding, without the king there to drive it, stalled and slowed and stopped. The great foundation lay cleared and empty, waiting for him to return. He did return. In the spring of 323 before the Common Era, after years away, after conquering more of the world than anyone had ever imagined, Alexander came back to Babylon and made it, at last, the capital of his empire, the seat from which he would rule everything from the Adriatic to the Indus. He filled the city with plans, new harbors, a great fleet, fresh campaigns. He was 32 years old, master of the world, and he had chosen this ancient city on the Euphrates to be the heart of it all. There were omens, the sources say. The Babylonian priests, reading their sky, warned him against entering the city or against entering it from a certain direction. Some historians think the priests had their own reasons, that they feared what an all-powerful king might do, or wanted to keep him away while they dealt with unfinished business at the temple. Alexander, torn between his own superstition and his impatience, hesitated, tried to obey, found the alternative route blocked by marshes, and in the end went in. And in Babylon, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, in the early summer of 323, Alexander the Great fell ill, a fever after a long night of drinking that would not break. Day by day it worsened. His soldiers, frantic, filed past his bed one by one to see him, and he could no longer speak, and could only move his eyes or lift his hand to acknowledge them. And after 10 days or so of fever, in the city he had chosen as the capital of the world, the man who had conquered more of the earth than anyone before him died, 32 years old, his vast empire barely a decade old and already, with his last breath, beginning to tear itself apart. They asked him, the story goes, as he lay dying, to whom he left his empire, and he answered, if he answered at all, to the strongest. It was the worst possible answer, and his generals spent the next 40 years proving it, carving up his conquests among themselves in war after war. And the great Tower of Babylon, cleared and leveled for rebuilding that its royal patron did not live to command, was never rebuilt. The empty foundation stayed empty. The mountain of brick that had reached for heaven was gone, and in its place was only a vast, flat, cleared platform, slowly gathering dust and weeds, exactly as the old story of the Tower of Babel had always said it would be. Unfinished. Abandoned. A monument to a pride that reached too high. Alexander's death in Babylon was the city's last moment at the true center of world history. For one brief season, it had been chosen, again, as the capital of everything. And then the man who chose it died in its oldest palace, and the moment passed, and this time it did not come back. What came after was the long fading, and the long fading is, in its own quiet way, the most Babylonian part of the whole story. Chapter 18. The Long Silence. Cities do not usually die in a single dramatic blow. We imagine them destroyed, sacked, burned, ended in a night of fire. But that is rare. Far more often, and this is the true fate of Babylon, a city simply loses its reasons to exist one by one and empties out and returns to the earth so gradually that no one can say exactly when it stopped being a city at all. After Alexander, his generals fought over his empire, and this region fell to one of them, a man named Seleucus, who founded a dynasty. And Seleucus did the thing that finally, quietly doomed Babylon. He did not attack it. He built a rival. A brand new capital, a fresh Greek-style city on the Tigris, not far away, and he called it Seleucia. And he moved the center of government there and encouraged people to move there, and by some accounts even relocated much of Babylon's population to fill his new city. That was the real killing blow, and it was not a blow at all. It was a competitor. A newer, more convenient city, better placed for the trade routes of the New Age, drew the life out of Babylon the way a new road drains a town the old road used to feed. Slowly, the people left. Not all at once, not driven out, just over generations, drifting to where the work and the power and the future now were. But here is the thing that I find most moving about Babylon's long ending, and it is a detail that is easy to miss. Even as the city emptied, even as the palaces fell silent and the great avenues grew quiet, something in Babylon kept going for a remarkably long time. In the temple of Marduk and around it, a community of priests and scholars held on for centuries, keeping the old rituals as best they could, and above all, still watching the sky. The astronomical diaries, that unbroken chain of nightly observation, continued to be written in cuneiform on clay for 200 or 300 years after Alexander, deep into an age when the world outside had moved on to Greek and to new gods and new empires. In a half-abandoned city, in a dying language, a handful of old scholars kept looking up night after night and writing down the positions of the planets, faithful to a tradition already thousands of years old. keeping the longest scientific record in human history alive, almost to the very end. The last securely dated cuneiform tablet we have, the last gasp of a writing system that had lasted for 3,000 years, is an astronomical text. Someone in the ruins of Babylon, in the first century of the Common Era more or less, still watching the sky, still pressing wedges into clay, at the very end of the world's oldest literate civilization. And then the record goes silent. The last person who could read and write cuneiform died. We do not know his name or when, and with him a way of writing older than the pyramids simply ended and was not read again for nearly 2,000 years. By the early centuries of the Common Era, Babylon was ruins. Mud brick, remember, does not last without care. The unmaintained walls slumped. The great buildings melted, season by season, rain by rain, back into the mud they had been shaped from. The bricks were carried off by local people to build new things, as they would be for centuries, so that pieces of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon are scattered through the walls of villages and towns built long after. And the wind brought the dust, and the dust settled, and grass grew over the mounds, and in time there was nothing to see but low, strange hills on the plain, and the memory of a name. Travelers came over the centuries looking for it, guided by the Bible and the old Greek writers, and often they could not even find it, or pointed at the wrong mound, or doubted it had ever been real at all. The greatest city of the ancient world had become a rumor, a heap of nameless earth beside the Euphrates, its towers and its blue gate and its hanging gardens sunk back into the plain, remembered by everyone and located by no one. And there Babylon lay silent for the better part of 2,000 years, not destroyed, not even really ruined in the violent sense, just gently, endlessly returned to the earth. The city of mud gone back to mud, only the name still standing, huge and bright, in the memory of half the world, attached to a place that no one could find. Until, at last, people came with shovels and began, very carefully, to dig. Chapter 19. What Remains, and Why the World Kept Babylon. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists came to the mounds beside the Euphrates and began to dig, and slowly, out of the dust, Babylon came back. Not the whole of it. Much is gone forever, melted to mud, or carried off, or still buried, or lost beneath the high water table that has ruined the oldest and deepest layers. And much of what was found was damaged and confusing, a maze of mud brick foundations that took decades of patient work to make sense of. But they found it. They found the line of the great walls and the foundations of the palaces and the vast cleared platform where the tower had stood, and, most spectacularly, the shattered pieces of the Ishtar Gate and the processional way, which, as we have seen, were carried to Berlin and rebuilt, so that the blue gate of Babylon shines again, indoors, under northern skies. And they found the writing. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, the marriage contracts and the barley loans and the schoolboys' exercises and the sky diaries and the king's proud inscriptions, and out of them, patiently, over generations, scholars relearned the lost languages and reread the silent city, until we knew more about daily life in Babylon than about almost any other ancient place. The clay kept its promise. The city that melted back into the earth had written itself down, and the writing waited in the ground until we were ready to read it, and gave the vanished city back its voice. So that is what remains. Foundations in the dust of Iraq, a blue gate in a German museum, hundreds of thousands of clay tablets in the collections of the world. The way we measure an hour in a circle and read a horoscope, a psalm sung by the rivers, and a name, still enormous, that everyone knows. Which brings us, at the very end of the night, back to the question we started with. Why? Why this city, of all the great cities of the ancient world? Others were as large, as rich, as old. Nineveh was as mighty, or was older. Why is Babylon the one whose name every child somehow knows? The one that became the very word for human greatness and human pride, for paradise and for sin. Part of it, I think, is simply that Babylon was there, at the crossroads, when the traditions that shaped our world were being made. The Greeks came and marveled at it and wrote it into their idea of Eastern splendor. And, far more powerfully, the Hebrew exiles wept by its rivers and wrote it into their scriptures, twice over, as the city of wonders and the city of wickedness, the destroyer of the temple, the gilded whore, the tower of pride, and also, in the very same tradition, the place where their faith deepened into something universal. Babylon became a character in the most read book in the history of the world, and once you are a character in that book, you do not fade. The real mud brick city could melt back into the plain, and it did. But the Babylon of the imagination, the symbol, the dream, and the warning only grew. And so the name outlived the place by 2,000 years and outgrew it. We call any great, proud, doomed metropolis a Babylon. We speak of the Tower of Babel whenever people cannot understand one another. We reach for the hanging gardens whenever we want a symbol of impossible, luxurious beauty. The city itself lies in the dust, but its name is one of the most alive words we have. And here, right at the end, is the last of the ironies this city keeps producing, and it is the one I want to leave you with as you drift off. Babylon was built by a king who was desperate to be remembered, who stamped his name into the hidden hearts of his bricks so that even ruin could not erase it. And he got his wish, but not in the way he meant. Nebuchadnezzar is remembered, yes, but mostly as a name in a story about pride and its fall, told by the very people he carried into exile. The city that tried hardest to make itself eternal in brick and glaze melted back into mud within a few centuries. And what actually made it immortal was not the walls or the gate or the tower, it was the words, the clay tablets that survived the fire, the psalm the captives sang, the parable of the tower. The city built to be seen was saved in the end by the things that were written down. The walls have fallen. The gate is in a museum. The gardens, if they were ever there at all, dried up before the Greeks could agree on where they hung. The tower is a cleared and empty platform under the Iraqi sun. Nebuchadnezzar has been asleep for 26 centuries, and Cyrus, and Alexander, and Belshazzar, and the weeping exiles, and the old priests who watched the sky until the very end. Everyone in this story has been at rest for a very, very long time. There is nothing left in any of it that needs your attention tonight. Only a great city on a dark river still standing, if you wanted to, in the one place it was never buried, in the memory of the people who could not let it go. That is where we will leave it, Babylon at rest. Thank you for spending these hours with me and with a city that has been gone for 2,000 years and is somehow still here. If this quiet journey helped you unwind or drift off, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. If you would like more nights like this one, subscribing is how the next one finds you, and it helps this channel more than you might think. New documentary every week, same calm, same pace. Sleep well. The rivers are still running, the name is still standing, and we will meet again in another old city next week.